Good afternoon and welcome. We're so pleased that you could join us today. I'm Dr. Karen Philbrick, and I have the pleasure of serving as the Executive Director of the Mineta Transportation Institute at San Jose State University. Better known as MTI, we are a competitively selected United States Department of Transportation University Transportation Center. We focus on improving the mobility of people and goods in our great nation, and we accomplish that goal through surface transportation research, technology transfer, workforce development, and education. And in fact, I see a couple of our graduates in our Masters of Science in Transportation Management program. So thank you for being here. I welcome each of you that are present in this room and those joining us online to the MTI Visiting Scholar Series. Our goal with this series was really to bring directors, mid-level managers, frontline staff, academics, students, and elected officials together to learn about high-priority research topics. I think we can all agree that transportation finance is one of those topics. We see this series as really developing people in three areas. Number one, together, we're going to learn about the high-priority policy issues in a topic area that's critically important. We're going to gain a common understanding because we're all here, no matter what level we're at. And three, this really increases morale because it's an inclusive process. And with that common understanding, we think we can move research into practice. Now, in addition to welcoming all of you, two very special welcomes. One to Helen Wachs, Marty's wife. Thank you for being here. This is delightful. And to Tyler Monson, our Caltrans grant manager, who has taken the train here from Sacramento today to be with us. Thank you. I'd like to thank VTA CEO Nuria Fernandez, who is also a trustee for the Mineta Transportation Institute, for graciously hosting today's event. And a very, very special thank you to Karen Goss and Brandy Childress. This would not be possible without your assistance, so thank you. A brief comment about the run of show before I turn it over to our scholar. He will be delivering comments for approximately 45 minutes. If you have any clarifying questions, keyword clarifying, please feel free to ask those in real time. If there are other questions, please hold those until his comments are concluded. You may either ask your questions verbally, or we invite you to fill out the question cards in front of you, which will be collected. Just raise them, because we're going to break at 12 noon. We'll be joined by Nuria Fernandez. We'll have a light networking lunch, and then we'll reconvene the discussion at approximately 12:20, and that's where the heart of the dialogue will occur. So please, fill out those comment cards. Now, I know we're not interested in hearing me talk more, so without further ado, please let me introduce award-winning scholar, Dr. Marty Wachs. He's a distinguished professor emeritus of urban planning at UCLA. He has published more than 160 journal articles, 4 books, all on various areas in transportation. Currently, his research focuses on transportation finance in relation to planning and policy. He has had an incredible impact on the transportation workforce of today. He has literally mentored and developed thousands of students during his career. Please join me in welcoming Marty.
It's indeed an honor to have been invited to be a visiting scholar by the Mineta Transportation Institute, and I thank Karen and her colleagues for the invitation and for the wonderful care that they gave in the build-up to this. The only problem I had at all was that Waze, trying to find this place, led us into somebody's driveway. But that's not their fault. There are, I think it's 5 or 6 screens around the room, and I have one pointer. So when I want to point, I will point behind me and hope that you can figure out what you see on the other screens when I do that. So on November 6th, very soon, a couple of days away really, almost 2 weeks, Proposition 6, of course, is a transportation measure on the California ballot, and it has the attention of all of us. But it's not the only time and place in which, it's far from the only time and place at which the voters are deciding and making transportation policy. And on this slide, I've just listed some of the facts and figures that, when I actually dug them out, surprised me, and I presume might be surprising to you. Voters in 25 states will decide on over 250 transportation-related ballot measures on November 6th, just in one election. And the total amount of money at stake in those measures is $55 billion. But that's not all. We've had primary elections all over the country earlier in this year, and in this calendar year already, 196 other transportation finance-related measures have been voted on by the electorate across the entire country. So while we focus on, on one measure in one election, we also sort of put it into perspective that we've kind of changed in the United States the way we make transportation policy, and the voters all over the country are playing a larger role. Whoops, what just happened? And so this is very important because of the scale of it. And so in this talk, I will look a little bit at the history of voting for transportation investments in Los Angeles County as a case study, and in California as a whole. And because California has, in fact, more measures than any other state, and because, in part, what's happening in other states, like Missouri, this election, is kind of modeled after California, is kind of following a trend set in California. It's important to look at our own state. It has a longer history of this than other states, and many of the measures in other states are kind of imitations of what has been happening in California. And we're all in California, depend upon California for financing the programs we work in. So we'll stick to California, but it is a national issue. And then I want to take a deeper dive into local option sales taxes, which is the California invention that is funding public transit, but also streets and highways and other transportation projects all across the state. And one reason to focus on it is that it's enormously important, but another is that we're in Santa Clara County, which is central to the history of local option sales taxes. It was the place where the first one occurred in 1976. It's the place where the Gordino decision was rendered, and that led to the requirement that these be approved by a supermajority of 2/3. And because the election is so close, and because we're in a public facility and we're mostly public officials, the talk will not address Proposition 6 in any sort of advocacy way. We won't predict or analyze or take any positions on Proposition 6. It wouldn't be appropriate in this forum. I suspect most of us have pretty well formulated positions on Proposition 6. So there have been a wide variety of transportation ballot measures across the country, and they're not all sales taxes. We tend to think of sales taxes in California. There have been property tax increases, which in California have been more limited because of Proposition 13. There have been real estate transaction taxes for transportation. That is, when somebody buys or sells real estate, there's an extra fee, a charge, which goes into a transportation account. Many states have enacted increased vehicle license fees. There have been fuel tax increases in some states voted on by the electorate. And many statewide measures, but there has been a steady pattern of why so many state measures, and that's because of devolution from the federal to the state and eventually to the local level. The federal government is not providing the funding it did 20 and 25 and 30 years ago. That puts pressure on the states. The states have been, in many cases, short of funds and have forced, in a way, the local governments to take up the slack and to raise money for their own projects. And it's important as context to see this box in the lower right-hand corner, the last bullet point on the right. that in California, before SB 1, 2017, just before the enactment of a new tax, the transportation finance was mostly from local governments. 16 billion from local governments, 12 billion from the state, and 7 billion, a much reduced number in comparison with past decades, from federal sources. And the local governments, of course, provide the support for local streets and highways and county roads, primarily out of general revenues of those agencies, which means largely property taxes. It's not exclusively, but largely. And of course, Proposition 13 limits that, and that's part of the impetus for local option sales taxes. But I think it's important, we tend to overlook how large a role local governments, counties and municipalities play in the funding of transportation, unless of course we work for them, as some of you do, and then you're well aware of it. So outside of California, on the same day that we will be deciding on Proposition 6, in Connecticut, voters will decide on a constitutional amendment to put the state's transportation fund into a trust fund, which is common in many other states, but it's not the case in every state. In Colorado, voters will be considering two competing transportation measures, one that raises new revenue for all transportation modes, and one that raises money only for road improvements. And there's, as you might imagine, there's a vigorous pre-election campaigning going on. Vote yes on this one, or vote yes on that one, or no on each, and so on. And the idea behind having two competing measures is that there was indecision as to whether either could pass, and they're trying that, and you'll see later that there are many precedents in California of having multiple measures for the voters to sort out. In Missouri, voters will be voting on Proposition D, which would raise the gasoline tax to fund transportation improvements. And the first three bullets on this slide show state measures, but it's also true that a lot of the measures across the country, that large number that I cited earlier, are more local, like the local option sales taxes in California. So for example, in Hillsborough County, which includes Tampa, Florida, voters will decide whether to raise a sales tax to fund transportation improvements. And if you look at that measure, not that it's an immediate direct import to us in California, if you look at it, you see an echo of what we've been doing in California for the last 25 or 30 years. It's clearly modeled after local option sales taxes in California, and that's another reason why local option sales taxes in our state are important to look at. And the print is very small, but you don't have to absorb each item. It's a table from a report that we just finished at UCLA, in which we looked at Los Angeles County and direct democracy. That is, the participation of voters in decision making. And what amazed us when we got this data was the number of early days. Whoops, I think I hit something I didn't need. Whoops. What's happening?
Yeah, I think it's just sensitive.
It's very sensitive.
There, okay. I was trying to hit the pointer, and I must have hit something else. So, maybe I shouldn't point. But look at this, in 1868, 1905, 1905, 1909, 1910, 1913, 1915. These were voter-approved measures to fund transportation, including railroads, which were a much more prominent part of the transportation system back then, and roads and tunnels. The 2nd Street, 3rd Street tunnel under Bunker Hill in Los Angeles was paid for by a bond issue that voters approved, and has been in use for 150 years or so. And so notice that there were many measures prior to World War II, and it was quite common to have a vote on transportation issues. In 1924, the voters in Los Angeles disapproved a large regional rail transportation system that would have been financed, if it had passed, by value capture, by taxing the land near the stations that would where growth would accrue. And interestingly, it was 7 years after the Russian Revolution, right, 1917, and it was portrayed by its opponents as socialism. You know, the Bolsheviks are coming because they're going to take your land and put it in the public sector and use it to finance transit, and it was defeated. So there are many precedents, even to the arguments that we have today about the strategies we might use, and they go way back, 100 years and more. So it's also important to note that there was kind of a hiatus in the use of voting to raise transportation revenue between, let's say, roughly, not precisely, 1930 and 1970. And why was that? And I think it's almost obvious when you start to think more deeply about these issues, and it's the gas tax that explains it. The states adopted gasoline taxes and diesel fuel taxes between about 1918 and 1940. By 1940, when there were 48 states, all but one had a statewide gas tax. And the first one was in 1918 in Oregon. And California adopted in 1922 the legislation, 1923 the tax started. And the gasoline tax was a wonderful source of financing for transportation because the more we drove, and everybody was buying cars and driving more every year, and trucks were using the roads more, the more you drove, the more revenue you produced. And you needed more roads, of course, but the revenue grew in parallel, roughly, with the expansion of the transportation system. And the Federal Highway Trust Fund, which was adopted as late as 1956, when the interstate system was started, was preceded by a federal gasoline tax, which did, even though the federal government funded its share of road investments with general revenues, part of the general revenues was gasoline and diesel tax that was started in the 1930s, 1932. So there was lots of money because there was growth in the use of highways, and vehicles were not radically improving in terms of fuel efficiency from year to year. So there were less of a need for voter-approved measures over several decades, and there was actually kind of an understanding that the gas tax would be great forever. You know, it was just like a magical, wonderful way to raise money. It's a user fee, like a toll, and without the administrative costs of collecting a toll. Imagine if in 1920 we put toll booths on all the roads and we had no automation in toll collection. We had to put people in the toll booth and pay them. Well, about 30% of the revenue would have been would be taken by the toll collection costs, whereas the gasoline tax has administrative or collection costs of about 1%, which is pretty magical. So it was a wonderful system. And car ownership and miles of driving grew steadily, and the revenue grew steadily through all those years, so there were fewer elections. But we came to the point where the gas tax started to falter, and we began to notice it in the 1970s. And the curve on the right shows the declining real value, corrected for inflation, of the gasoline tax revenue, and it jumps up when the excise tax is raised by a state legislature or by the federal government, and it starts to decline again because inflation and improved fuel economy takes its toll. And even with periodic gasoline tax increases, the buying power has declined. So the text on the left shows that, for example, Congress raised the federal gas tax 8 times between 1956 and 1993, usually by 2 cents or 3 cents, and most by 5 cents whenever they've done that, about every 4 or 5 years. But there's been no federal fuel tax increase since 1993, and the current federal tax is 18.4 cents a gallon. The federal gas tax was 17% of the price at the pump in 1993, and it's 8% in 2017. So obviously, we're losing the revenue in real terms that we were depending on so much over those years. So around 1970, we began to think of alternative ways of raising additional money, revenue for transportation. The purchasing power of the gas tax, federal and state combined, declined by about 35% between 2003 and the passage of SB 1, and presumably that was one of the motivations for the passage of SB 1. And it's not just inflation, but the real challenge looking to the future is the increased fuel efficiency of the fleet. So vehicles literally do achieve the 54.5 miles per gallon, and it's disputed, and the Trump administration would like to roll these numbers back, but 55.4 miles per gallon by the year 2025, that the Obama administration put in place, that would really take a toll on the gas tax revenue. It's not that it's not a good idea for greenhouse gases and air quality and energy independence. All of those are important things, but the reality is that we'll have to find an alternative to gasoline tax to fund our transportation systems if we ever get to those levels. And of course, California is in the lead with respect to the plan and hope, I don't know which word is a better descriptor, to have a large proportion of the fleet be electric vehicles which use no gasoline. So the gasoline tax would become, if we're successful, and half the fleet of new cars is electric, we simply must find alternatives to the gasoline tax. So this is a chart showing estimates of the growth in vehicle miles of travel through 2030. And there are two estimates. The green one is from the Federal Highway Administration. The orangey one is from the Energy Information Administration, which is part of the U.S. Department of Energy. They differ in, to some extent, but their trend is in very similar directions. Meanwhile, fuel economy is expected to look like that purplish chart, and the gap, therefore, between the need, measured by travel on highways, and the revenue, which parallels or is impacted by fuel consumption, is widening over time and expected to widen even more in the coming decade. So many statewide transportation measures have started to take place in recent years, since 1970, which was sort of that break point that that I pointed out in a previous slide. So for example, in California in 1971, the voters approved, it was very complex, by the way. I'll get to that in a moment. Voters approved the Transportation Development Act, which to people who work at transit agencies like this one, very important because it created the transit account in the state financing of transportation. And what it did was it extended the sales tax, the general statewide sales tax, to gasoline, which was previously exempt from the sales tax because it was the subject of its own gas excise tax. And in extending it, it then allocated the money to public transit, but other improvements. And any county which had no public transit need could allocate it to roads, for example. But when I say it was complex, it had to be approved by the voters in every county as the way the measure was written. And it was almost miraculous that it actually was. That in order for it to take place, to take effect at the state level, it had to be approved in every county. Proposition 1A is another well-known way that voters in California have participated more recently in the generation of revenue for transportation programs. It created a bond issue with $9.95 billion in 2009. And it not only provided the revenue, but it also had wording in the measure that most people who I talked to today who voted for, I voted for it because I believe in high-speed rail, people say, or I voted against it because I think it's a boondoggle, but they don't note that that measure actually had other terms in it, like trains had to be capable of going between Los Angeles and San Francisco in under 2 hours and 40 minutes. That's in the measure, and voters approved that. And that affects the cost of the system. In order to have that capability, there has to be certain grades and tunnels and curvature of the track, which drives cost up as well as providing for the revenue. And there are other such provisions in the measure that were voter approved, and therefore also makes it harder to change them, right? If you say, well, the legislature ought to ease up on that term of the measure, well, let's say, well, we can't because it was approved by the voters. It was a proposition, and of course, over time, there have been a number of propositions addressing the question of the so-called lockbox or trust fund. Diversion is in the eye of the beholder to some highway interests. Using highway funds, highway generated like gas tax funds for transit is diversion. To other people, to use for transportation is consistent with the intent of the legislation. In Proposition 91 in 2009, tried to create a lockbox for all transportation revenue, and it was defeated. Proposition 69 in June of this year tried again, and it was approved. Again, it's subject to interpretation, and there are always lawsuits to clarify what was meant by the voters. But the voters took a very direct part in the generation of transportation policy. Now, what I don't know, and I think a lot of people don't know, even as we study these measures in depth, do voters actually understand the issues they're voting on? When I spoke recently at 2 or 3 public events, and people asked me questions which would imply that they didn't know what they're voting on. So for example, people expressed opinions on high-speed rail and said, that's why I'm voting for or against Proposition 6, which is really not about high-speed rail. And so it gives me, I scratch my head and say, well, these people are important because they're making the policy, and yet they don't seem to exactly grasp what they're voting on. And the measures are complicated. And do they actually read them all, or do they read an endorsement in the pro and con arguments in the ballot book, which are not the most accurate, and the endorsements of newspapers and candidates. And what appears to be the case is that they often change their minds after voting. Oh, if I had known that, I wouldn't have voted for it, or if I had known that, I would have voted for it. Yeah.
Clarifying question. Can you comment on voters? My understanding is that if they don't understand the issue, they may be likely to vote no with more frequency. Can you comment on that in relation to?
Yes, that's well known by political scientists that voters who don't understand, who feel they don't understand the issue, are more likely to vote no than vote yes by a substantial margin, 25–30%. However, what worries me is that some voters think they know the issue and don't, and that's also a fact. So they vote very enthusiastically, misunderstanding what they're voting for or against. So both of those issues are still on the table, and most of our research really, we rely on secondary sources for that. We've been looking at transportation measures. We haven't been looking at research on votes. We haven't been doing research on voting behavior, though we've been reading it. I don't exactly understand why that keeps happening, but let's go. Okay. So the majority of what I would like to talk about today is the research that we've been doing at UCLA in collaboration with others at UC Berkeley and at the Mineta Transportation Institute on local option sales taxes, which are the county measures, measure A, measure B, measure M, or proposition A or B or M, depending on where it originated. If it originated by voter petition or by a legislator, it has the name measure or proposition. Proposition 13 probably created the context because it makes property tax less readily available for many purposes, because the flow of property taxes is reduced as a result of the passage of Proposition 13 in the 70s. And instead, what has emerged are voter-approved specialized sales taxes for transportation. And they have a kind of similarity to one another. Part of that similarity is because the requirements are written in state law, but part is just that some imitate others, and because they pass, we want ours to pass, so we're going to do what they did in County Act. So some of the features of these is that the measures themselves include expenditure plans. So if you vote for this measure, we're going to build the following 28 projects over the next 35 years. And there's a commitment to building those projects. And you ask, I ask, is that a good idea or a bad idea? Well, the voters seem to like it. They think, if I vote for this, I know I'm getting the widening of this highway or the addition of miles to this transit route. And that's what I want. I voted explicitly for it. At least we believe that most of the voters consider the projects that affect them directly when they vote for it or against it. On the other hand, if you commit to 28 projects in the next 35 years, and years go by, decades go by, and needs change, and traffic patterns change, and technology changes, and there's little provision for changing the list of projects, or limited provision for changing the list of projects, you could also argue that it creates inflexibility. And the voters like inflexibility. They don't want those politicians to be taking their money and spending it on other things. We've heard that quite frequently. But it also limits the flexibility of government to respond to changing conditions. Most of these measures, and this is a little bit, it sort of mitigates that last point. Most of the measures have fixed sunset dates, many 20 years, 30 years, 40 years, and some as short as 5 and 10 years. And therefore, they would have to be reauthorized. So the voters go to the polls and they vote for the measure, which expires unless they vote again to extend it, expand it, increase the taxation rate, or anything of that sort. I'll show you some data about that later. And many of them have accountability provisions and limits on the ability of the transit authority that in the area of in the geographic area, the county in which the measure has been approved, they have limits on amendments. So the transportation authority cannot just say, well, the voters approved this project, it's no longer relevant. We're going to approve another project as a substitution. The ability to do that is limited. So for example, in Measure M, which raised a great deal of money in Los Angeles County, the language in the proposition said that the expenditure plan can be amended by a vote of the Transportation Authority, the LA County Metro Board, once in 10 years with a 2/3 majority. So that's pretty stringent, limited, and it's hard to get that kind of vote. And if you do it now, you can't do it for another 10 years. So there are those provisions that limit flexibility, but it appears that the voters like to limit politicians' flexibility. And the accountability provisions, they vary greatly across the state. In Los Angeles County, a panel of 3 retired judges is specified in the measure. They meet twice a year and review what the Transportation Authority is spending money on and approve it as consistent or call out that it's not consistent with what the voters approved. In San Diego County, there is an appointed panel that reviews the expenditures, and the newspapers in San Diego County recently had a field day with a quote expose that the chairman of the panel that's supposed to guarantee that the voters get what they voted for was the president of a large construction company and president of the General Contractors Association of San Diego County. And that may not be the best form of accountability, at least in the minds of the San Diego Union Tribune. So this slide shows, and it comes out, it's interesting, it comes out better on some screens, on the TV screens than on the larger screen. It shows the rise of local option sales taxes over time. And there is let's see if I can point without getting rid of the slides entirely. At this point here, is the break point between the years in which the a simple majority was required, and the court decided in the Guardino decision that a 2/3 majority is required because these are defined as, quote, special taxes, special purpose taxes, and for that reason, the Proposition 13 and a couple of succeeding propositions that were meant to elaborate on Proposition 13, I won't go into all the details, made it clear that the voters want to have a supermajority requirement. And it is true that the number of measures that have passed haven't seemed to be dampened by the 2/3 requirement. These measures are generally pretty popular. So the lighter color is failed measures, and the darker color is passed measures. And the number that have passed seems to be pretty steadily over time a very robust number. And I think that the actual number right now, I may be off by one, but I think there are 26 counties in which there are measures in place right now, out of 56 counties in California, 50 something, mid-50s. And the ones that have measures are urban counties and therefore have large populations. So it's about 85% of the population of the state lives in the counties that have such measures in place. And sometimes a measure expires and isn't renewed. That's why the exact number is hard for me to fish for. The number of measures in place changes from year to year. Sometimes they're renewed by the voters. Sometimes new counties add some. But it's right now at around 26. It could be 27. I'm 100% sure. So we have been engaged in research on local option sales taxes at UCLA. A lot of the work being done by master's and doctoral students and by 2 or 3 faculty. I'm certainly not the only one engaged in this. But among the things we've done is we've collected the actual text of 53 county measures and have digitized it. We have it all available to us and can search it by keywords and so forth. And we don't have 100% of the measures, and that was an amazing thing. We call the county registrar, recorder, and they say, oh, that measure was 20 years ago, and it didn't pass, so we don't have a record of it. We don't know the language. So we couldn't find 100%, but we have a very large proportion of them. We also collected pro and con ballot arguments, newspaper endorsements, and analyses. We got League of Women Voters analysis of the measures. In some cases, there is an organization at the county level that is somewhat like the State Legislative Analyst's Office that offers an unbiased analysis. We have those where they exist. They don't exist everywhere. And we've gotten voting records for and against the measures by precinct, and then it's hard to do, actually, surprisingly hard to do as a researcher, to take census data, which is not done by precincts, and make the census tract data compatible with the precinct data in order to do analysis. We've done that. And we've interviewed so far about 50 election officials, measure proponents, and opponents in many counties. We've case studied like 6 or 8 counties more than other counties, but we've analyzed data for all the counties that have such measures. And this is, in a way, the most complicated, but in a way, the most interesting slide. It's filled with information, so I'm going to take a moment to try to explain. And let's see if I can face the screen so that I can see, and at the same time pop into the microphone. This represents a simple majority, 50%. This represents 2/3. And the dark blue is the percentage of people who voted. This is, in other words, the vertical axis adds to 100%. Ah!
Really a new one.
Okay. The vertical axis adds to 100%. And the dark blue are the people voting for measures which passed. The light blue are people voting for measures which failed. And then the yellow on top is darker for the measures that, for the people voting against measures which passed, because you can see where they crossed that higher line. And the paler yellow goes with the paler blue. Those are measures that failed. Okay, I hope that explanation was clear. But again, if you look across just for the whole pattern, whether they passed or failed, whether they required a simple majority or a 2/3 majority, supermajority, the pattern seems to show that these measures are reasonably popular. If that is, and I summarized the data at the bottom, 8 of 50 measures since the 1995 Guardino decision, which is 16%, failed to get even a simple majority. That's a small percentage, you would think, when you're taxing, people are voting to tax themselves. 15 of the 50, 30%, received a majority vote in favor, but not the supermajority that was required. And 27 of the 50, which is 54%, received the supermajority and were enacted. And a word of caution in interpreting this, some were enacted the second try and the third try, and in one county at least, it took 4 tries, but it finally got enacted. So the politics of this is complicated, but the dominance of the blue color over the yellow color, California colors, of course, indicates that that more people vote for these measures than vote against them. Consistently in many counties, rural and urban and suburban, and they may not all get the supermajority, but the pattern as a whole is they're more popular than you might guess. And that's why we keep going back to the public and saying, we want you to vote on another measure. Even in counties which have had 2 or 3 measures, they vote on the 4th one, and 2 or 3 in place, they vote on the 4th one, as in LA County, and vote yet another tax on top of the taxes that are already in place. So it's been a very lucrative source of financing for transportation in our state. And when I changed that word terms several times, what I mean is the time period during which the tax is in place according to the measure. So some of them are 15 years, some of them are 20 and 30 are the highest bars. And so most of the measures that are enacted have limited terms. And the most common limited terms are 20 years or 30 years. But some of them are 10, and some of them are 40, and a few are permanent. Interestingly, 93% have specified lives, specified terms. And only 5 were permanent, and 4 of the 5 passed, and those were all in Los Angeles County. So Los Angeles has, it's interesting that Proposition A in 1980, Proposition C in 1990, Measure M in 2016, all had permanent additions to the sales tax. But Measure M also made a previously termed one permanent. And so now there is a permanent 2% sales tax in Los Angeles County, and that's why they have the revenue to build the rail lines and other improvements, bus extensions and bus rapid transit, that are reasonably well known to everyone. It's largely voter-approved sales tax measure. Now, when considering sales taxes, it's important to note that sales taxes are regressive. That by regressive, the term is usually meant to mean that they take a higher proportion of a family's income for low-income families than for upper-income families. And this curve, which is our analysis, and each dot is a precinct in an area that has had a local option sales tax election, and it's a 0.5% local sales tax as a proportion of the median household income, and it's for 7 counties. It's a sample. We weren't going to do every precinct in the county. But what we found was that the burden as a percent of income was higher for low-income families. The income across the horizontal axis is 20,000, 40,000, 60,000, up to 240,000. And then it rises again, and that's in part because at very high incomes, over 180,000, 200,000, people spend much more, and they spend on things that are taxed with sales taxes, and so it again rises. But if you think of regressivity as important for especially lower income households, it's clear that as income rises, the proportion of income spent on these sales taxes decreases up till around, what, $140,000 of household income. But gas taxes are regressive too, and they fall more heavily upon lower income households if they own a car. But that's the point in a way. At least if you're a low income consumer of gasoline, you get the benefits of using the roads. If you're paying a sales tax, you may not use the roads, although you could argue back that every good that's delivered to a supermarket or to a department store that a low-income person buys is there as a result of the use of the road. So it's a controversial issue as to how you should actually measure regressivity. But I think there's a general sense that the local option sales tax is highly regressive and probably more regressive, that could be argued, than a gas tax, because at least the gas tax is used for the purposes, the distance between the purpose for which it's used and the way in which it's collected is much smaller. And it goes more directly to transportation. And so we should be concerned as we increase the number of these taxes about the burden that we are creating on lower income households, especially in this time when the gap between low and high income is growing rather than contracting. Okay, so I think I got it right. I don't know I apologize for this. I don't know what I'm doing.
I don't think it's you.
I did, okay. I accept that, it's not me.
It's not you.
So, local option sales tax. What's really interesting to me is that they have created a new transportation politics in California. And most of us experience that every day, and we may feel it and think about it and analyze it in the context of our own county. But it's actually quite a general phenomenon across the whole state. These measures don't just happen to pass because they're inherently popular. There's a whole industry of campaign consultants and former public officials who work as campaign consultants, and they have learned by trial and error how to get the votes and what makes people, what influences people when they vote for them and against them. And so they shape the measures to appeal to the voters. To get 2/3 is not a small challenge. But I keep asking over and over again, is the best transportation program for a county the one that gets the most votes? Or is it different? They don't use cost-benefit analysis on these projects. They ask what will get us the 2/3 vote. And once it's enacted, it's a commitment. So this is a new political reality that's very important. Does what is done to achieve a supermajority match what would be the best transportation plan for the county? I think I have to answer that one by saying generally no, and that to me is a problem. But in a sense, the third bullet point says, this is an academic question in a way, because the revenue is needed and elections are held, and there are few alternatives in many of these counties. So of course we may differ from one another in believing how much should be spent on what, but it's not an unimportant question either. Just ask what the voters want it to be spent on. But then again, you come back to the question, do the voters really know what they're voting on, or are the campaign managers telling them this will be good, and are they believing it without deeply considering the question? And I fear that some of that is happening. So let me try to do this without blanking the screen. There we go. So here's an example, a specific example that I worked on with a DACO student named Jamie Letterman. In 3 counties, Riverside, Orange, and San Diego, early measures were opposed by environmentalists, like the Sierra Club and the Natural Resources Defense Council. Roads are bad. Let's not build more roads. Let's have people walk and use public transit and bicycles. And we oppose any measure that's going to spend money on roads. And there are a lot of environmentalists in California, and their membership was encouraged to vote against measures that would raise sales taxes in order to fund transportation. But as time went by, and Riverside started this, and Orange and San Diego did it more recently, in later measures in those counties, they committed to spending money on, for example, acquiring land to mitigate transportation impacts, buying up the habitat of endangered species, and holding it in reserve to use it as mitigation when a transportation project would be built 20 years and 30 years later. As a matter of fact, SB 1 creates a fund to do that at the state level, imitating what the success that these counties have had. But in those counties, environmental groups encourage their members to vote for those measures. And when you need a 2/3 majority and you get the environmentalists on board instead of in opposition, that makes a big difference. That may make the difference in a county like Orange, which is generally conservative and averse to taxes. It may make the difference between passing and failing. And so then there are people who say, well, transportation is transportation. I don't want to spend money to save the kangaroo rat, which has been a big issue in Riverside County. And other people say, well, if we can't save the kangaroo rat, then we shouldn't build the transportation. So it's a good expenditure.
Clarifying question, could you define what is early measures versus later measures?
Oh,
We're talking 70s?
early means 1970s and early 80s, and later means late 90s and 2000s. Thank you for that clarifying question. In time. So here's more of a sort of anecdotal, but I think persuasive evidence about the kind of politics that were created by local option sales taxes. In Sonoma County, each of these years had a 0.5% tax, except in the year 2000 when it had 2.5% taxes on the ballot. And in 1990, it failed with 46% of the vote. In 1998, it failed with about 48%. Each time they failed, they revised the list of projects and revised their campaign and revised what would be included. So they added transit and bikes to what had first been, widen the 101 was the principal focus of the initial one. The second one, widen the 101 and have a rail line between Marin and Sonoma. That failed, so they said, well, okay, maybe some people like highways and some people like rail. Let's separate them and see if people vote for one, and even if they defeat the other. And they both lost again, where they needed 2/3 and they didn't get them. But by 2004, again, they changed the map of the incidence of the projects, and they added more projects to the list, and they got barely the 2/3 majority. And so if you try and don't succeed, try again, but adjust the measure to what you've learned from the previous case. And that has happened elsewhere, but to me, Sonoma is the most dramatic example of that. So there are certain principles that have evolved now that we have so many of these measures to look at, as you saw in that chart with the yellow and blue. Each vertical was a measure. We know that the idea is to spread the money around geographically, especially in populated areas, so that every community gets a project and therefore considers voting for the measure. We know that we ought to spread the money across modal interests. So there are highways and rail and buses and bikes and pedestrians and ferries in these measures because there's a constituency for each one and you need 2/3 of the vote. Spread the money over time, but make sure, because you can't build all the projects promised in the first 5 years because the money is going to flow over 20 or 30 years. So space out the projects over time, but make sure each community gets at least some of the money early. Otherwise, they're going to say, I'm not voting for this if I don't get any money until 2035. So they got to get something early. And also achieve a balance among capital projects, building new things, and operating projects, that is funding the operations of the local bus system. And so what they end up doing is promising relief on many fronts for many interests. But all politics are local, and there are a few exceptions that are local that are pretty interesting. For example, Napa had a measure that would fund local government transportation. 95% of the money in the measure would go back to the cities in Napa County. 5% would be kept at the county level to administer the program. That's an exception to this pattern. There are other exceptions, but only a few. This pattern is quite general. So this, again, I'm sorry the print is a little small on the left, but it shows how much on average, mean is the average, and median means half or below that and half or above it, and the range is the lowest value and the highest value. How much of the money in 53 measures that we looked at goes to highways, how much to transit, how much to local roads, how much to bike and pedestrian, how much to safe routes to schools, very small amount of money, but in some counties it's important to get the votes, and how much goes to senior specialized services for seniors and disabled people. And clearly, when we analyze this data, notice, by the way, that in public transit, some measures are 100% for public transit, and some are zero. Obviously, rural counties have less public transit than urban counties. But the means, I think, really tell the statewide story. Urban counties clearly allocate a larger share of the funds raised by these measures to transit than the mode share of transit in those counties. So counties that have 3 and 5% mode share are allocating 30% of the money to transit. Transit is a clear beneficiary of these. And it may well be that people want to have a good transit system even when they don't get to ride it themselves. And that's the real politics of this, depending on these votes. Spreading the money geographically, we've learned, and of course you probably recognize this county, the purple is areas of the county, voting precincts, which supported the measure 20% below the county average. And the green is areas that supported it 20% above the county average. And lo and behold, the greatest support comes from areas near the projects. That isn't surprising, but it also causes county officials across the whole state to shape the measures in such a way that people live close, that the high concentration of population is close to the projects that are being funded. Just a few more slides. The issue of equity interested us. Are people saying these measures are unfair to the poor? Are people saying these measures help the working class? They're good for bicyclists and so on. We looked at equity arguments in the ballot measures, pro and con, and then supporting statements in media. But equity is a fuzzy concept, so we look at, they talk about equity just in general terms. And 29 measures did that, which is a small share of the total of 53 that we examined. Income equity, this is going to be not good for the poor, or it's especially good for the poor. Only 14 measures out of 53. And so on for geographic equity, that is, North County's getting money and South County isn't. Modal equity, transit's getting too much, highways aren't getting enough, that kind of statement. And temporal equity, the next generation is going to be paying for our services or vice versa. And only 8 measures featured a debate about those questions. And some of the language used in those debates are shown on the right. These are, that we had hundreds of statements in the ballot measures and in the arguments in the ballot book, and we chose a few to be illustrative. Many elderly citizens live in poverty. This tax will hurt seniors and reduces their buying power is an example. The word cloud on the left shows in ballot arguments for and against the words which appeared most frequently, the 53 measures. Interestingly, the words congestion, highway, local, projects, roads, traffic, transit are the ones that we use most often. That's what the debates were most about. And examples of what was said is on the right. A yes on Measure M to relieve traffic congestion, improve traffic safety, etc. And the next one is reduce gridlock. The third, reduce traffic congestion. Guess what? We cannot show that any money spent under local option sales taxes literally has directly reduced traffic congestion. But the voters care a lot about traffic congestion. So there's a lot of argument about traffic congestion. And empirically, we have a very difficult time. In fact, any place that we've done studies, like in the Exposition Corridor in Los Angeles, where there's a new rail service that was partly funded by local option sales taxes, there's no measurable effect on traffic congestion on the freeways that parallel the Expo line. But the voters think it's so important. So this was finesse. So recently, Measure M in Los Angeles featured a television commercial just days before the election, which showed Mayor Eric Garcetti driving a car on the Santa Monica freeway, totally uncongested. and he spoke into the microphone saying, vote for the measure, and it will improve transit and provide for bikeways and so on. He never mentioned congestion, but the message was conveyed visually. And you could say, well, he didn't lie. He didn't say it would reduce congestion, because he never said that. But the intent of the commercial was quite obvious. So just a few more points. We started late, but I'm over time. Just one or two more points, really. What's changing right now over time, as you look at these measures from the 1970s to now, what's changing is the growth in what's called local return. That is, the measures return, they're county measures, and they return some of the funds to the cities within the county for the cities to spend on their own priorities. Their own priorities usually mean fixing potholes and doing maintenance on streets, and in some counties adding bike lanes, and cities within counties adding bike lanes, doing pedestrian improvements, updating traffic signals, and so on. And there's a gradual increase in the proportion of these measures that takes money from the county and redistributes it to the city. Why would they do that? Well, lots of people live in lots of cities, and you want the endorsement of the city council and the mayor of a lot of cities in order to get the measure passed. So it sounds cynical. I mean, there are benefits, of course, to having that money available to the cities, but the trend is clear that one measure increases the local return, and then the next one imitates it and increases it a little more, and then the next one a little bit more. So the 95% high figure there was Napa. That was an outlier. If you take that out, you see that the trend is generally over time toward more money spent on local return. That's an interesting finding that we came up with that hadn't been examined much by others. So here's my big worry, kind of the last major point, to sort of wrap up. To get a supermajority vote, we promise more than we can deliver. It's almost obvious, isn't it? It's going to reduce congestion, it's going to help the elderly, it's going to improve transit, it's going to widen the highways, it's going to help local government. But then once the taxes are in place and the projects are under construction, we find that we don't have enough money to complete the projects that we committed to in order to get the voters to vote for the measures. So what do? Well, we go back to them for more money. But to get them more money, we promise them more projects. And this becomes, I don't know if it's a vicious circle or a virtuous circle, depending on your views, but this is a really big problem. You never have enough money. So I as recently as in the past month, sat with senior people at the Los Angeles County Metro who are going to receive $240 billion in the next 40 years. That's a lot of money. And they have bonded against it to build some projects. And guess what? They don't have enough money to build the projects that they promised. They particularly want to build 28 projects by 2028 for the Olympics. and there are 8 or 9 major capital projects that they simply can't do by 2028, given this flow of money. So their question is, how do we get more money? And the more money is required in order to fulfill the commitments that they made in earlier measures. And so what the voters get, and it is a criticism of most, the right, the political right tends to point this out over and over again, but empirically it's true that when you give politicians money, they ask for more money. And that's not an evil thing. It's sort of inherent that you have to do that in order to get the money in the first place. The measures don't pass unless you promise a great deal. But having promised a great deal, in order to deliver on it, you have to get more money. And this is happening. We observe it all the time. So our research is continuing, and this year we're doing more. We don't, I freely admitted before, and I'll admit again, we don't completely understand this the entirety of the complexity of this new politics. We're trying to. We're looking in depth into local returns because that is very important. It's complicated. In Los Angeles, the city of Los Angeles gets money back that's separate from what the county gets to build its rail line, and then the city of Los Angeles City Council allocates some of that money back to the rail line. So it's hard to investigate and find out where all the money goes, but it's interesting. We're looking in depth into this question of accountability. Are the counties shifting money away from the promised project? We found one instance that made our faces light up, and that's why we decided to look at this. We're reading the measures, and it said, this state route so-and-so is going to be extended from this location to this location. And then we found state route so-and-so has been extended from a different location to a different location than what's stated in the measure, and the county claimed that it was in compliance with the vote. And we said, well, is it or isn't it? The answer is it's ambiguous, right? So we are looking into that question. We're looking for consistency between claims made in the ballot and projects actually implemented. We're analyzing lawsuits brought against the counties for violating their local option sales taxes, and we're trying to research voter behavior because it's very hard to understand it, and we freely admit that as transportation people interested mostly in revenue and expenditures, we don't fully understand voters. So that's it, and I appreciate your attention. I'm sorry I ran a little late, but I'm open for comments and questions.
Thank you so much. Very, very insightful and educational. Before we open for questions, may I invite you to help yourself to lunch and a beverage. We'll take a brief 12 to 15 minute break right now, and then we'll reconvene with the dialogue. Reminder to submit your written comment cards. And before we break, I'd like to warmly thank Nuria Fernandez, CEO of Valley Transportation Authority and trustee, for joining us and for hosting us today. Thank you. As the state shifts away from congestion measures and toward VMT under CEQA, how do you think that will affect the conversation about and support for loss?
So rather than approving development projects on the basis of level of service of traffic, and thereby looking, for example, at an intersection impacted by new development, the state is looking instead to have developers of new property pledge in some way to reduce the vehicle miles traveled as generated by the project that they're putting in place. And the guidelines are in place, but they're changing over time. So we're not exactly sure that they're still new, and we're not exactly sure that in 5 or 10 years we'll be doing these calculations exactly as we are now. But here are some examples of things that developers have done under the new guidelines instead of trying to mitigate the flow of traffic at intersections, sometimes as much as 2 miles, 3 miles, 5 miles from the project, because they can be influenced. by trips generated by the new project. They have instead, for example, purchased a bus for the local transit operator and committed to operating subsidies for that bus, or 2 buses or 5, for the next 20 years. And it seems to me that those kinds of measures complement the measures in local option sales taxes and probably place less emphasis than in the past on things like widening streets and changing signal timing, and place more emphasis on things like participating financially in transit and bikeways and the other projects that are typically prominent in local option sales taxes. So I imagine those, I believe, without great evidence to back up my opinion, that it's probably helpful to local option sales taxes.
Thank you. We have a couple of questions related to Senate Bill 1. Specifically, you described how it is a regressive tax. How do you balance that with the fact that some estimates indicate that the average driver in California spends upward of $900 on annual maintenance and repair costs? So the average increase at the pump, $10 per month, $120 per year, versus $1,000 in maintenance costs.
Yeah, the empirical estimates of how much we pay are necessary in order to have a public debate, but have to be sort of deconstructed and looked at very carefully. The most money in repairs is spent by middle and upper income people. And if low income people have damage to their vehicles, they more often than upper income people don't use their vehicles or put it up on lots or get rid of it and use a bicycle or public transit. So the distribution of those costs is also in a way regressive in that when we claim that the average is $900, it can have much more dire effects on low-income families because it might deprive them of their automobility entirely. So I'm not sure how I relate that to the regressivity of the taxes, but I think, you know, in our society, there are many programs and many policies that are regressive, and that includes the damage to the roads is itself regressive, as is the tax. So we have to consider each jurisdiction, and we have to consider each population group, but I think it's a serious and continuing problem.
Absolutely. Has any authority been sued for failing to deliver all of the projects in their expenditure plan?
Not that I know of. That's a simple one to answer. I'm not aware of anyone who has been sued, but I am aware of interest groups saying, you didn't deliver our project and you asked for more money and we're going to oppose you, you know, with all of our energy and enthusiasm and resources. So it's a political question that's of very great prominence, so it may not have been tested in the court.
Thank you. We have a few questions related to the following. Can you speak more about the Guardino and its impact on transportation financing? Talked about a Guardino decision in the mid-70s and in the 90s, it appeared. Can you say more about that?
So people are, I presume that in this county where it took place, that there was more familiarity with what happened than elsewhere. But Santa Clara County put some measures on the ballot, and in response to threats that they would be sued, they went ahead and did 2 measures, one of which was, this is a general tax. It's not a special tax. Therefore, it only requires a simple majority. And then it had another measure on the ballot which said, if a general tax were to be approved, what transportation projects, here's a list of transportation projects, are you in favor or against us using a general tax to fund these measures? And people went to court and said that was a subterfuge, that it was really a special tax, and the court agreed. And so from that point onward, it was a settled issue that local option sales taxes would have to have a 2/3 majority rather than a simple majority. And Carl Guardino, who's still active as the president of the Silicon Valley Leadership Group, it used to be called Manufacturers Association, now it's Leadership Group, is still active in transportation policy and politics, and he was the person who defended against the suit, but the suit was won by those who brought suit against the county.
Excellent. And in addition to being the CEO of the Silicon Valley Leadership Group, he's a 3-time appointee to the California Transportation Commission, and he successfully led Measure B in 2016 to transportation funding. Next question. What percentage of transit improvement costs are paid for by voter-approved measures? For example, is it 10% across the state of California?
It's really different in different counties. So for example, Los Angeles with 2% sales tax, the percentage is higher than federal and state contributions combined. It's somewhere in the range of 60%. But I would say that's an outlier, and then in most counties, it's much less than that. It's 60% of the program that's planning to put in place over the next 40 years is sales tax supported. And then, of course, they're going after every matching dollar they can get. That's only responsible. But they can't count on it. And in other counties, it is closer to 10 and 15 and 20%. But in LA County, it's really an outlier. It's way up there.
That's incredible.
Yeah.
Thank you for sharing that information. Given the issues you cite with loss, can you either describe a better mechanism for funding transportation, particularly as it relates to financial support for biking, walking, and transit? But with that large percentage you just shared, how does that relate to this question as well?
That's a really difficult question because some scholars, including me, would argue for a couple of ways of raising revenue for transportation that are politically so unpopular that it's unrealistic to think that they're going to be implemented anytime in the next 20 or 30 years. I'll give you 2 examples. Congestion pricing. We believe that we can control traffic congestion on major facilities like the 101 by pricing. And pricing higher during peak periods and lower off-peak periods and on other less congested facilities directs people, encourages people to double up or triple up and save money, which would reduce congestion, to make trips by other modes when there's a high price, which would reduce congestion, and to take other routes that would reduce congestion, and to travel, to say, I'm going to go to work at 7 in the morning instead of 9, and have coffee and whatever before work at the work site in order to avoid paying the higher fee. So the congestion price to a transportation person is more about managing the flow. But politicians are very interested in the revenue produced by congestion pricing and are beginning to consider it as a real option. So for example, Los Angeles now has a network of express lanes where you can buy your way out of congestion by using what was formerly an HOV only lane by paying to use it. And with electronic collection of the revenue, it's an easy thing. It's relatively easy to implement. You don't have to put toll collectors out there anymore. A second, but nobody wants that. I mean, New York tried it. New York has terrible street congestion. The average traffic in Manhattan moves, below 8 miles per hour, 20 hours a day, and yet it was rejected. So there's it's a hard sell. We can't quite go there, but it would produce revenue, which in New York, as an example, would have been used for transit and pedestrian improvements. And that is what's being done in London, where they have congestion pricing. It's mostly going into buses. So that's one example. That's what scholars would say, but we understand that nobody listens to scholars in the real world. The second is, I mentioned briefly already, is value capture. The idea that if you own land that is highly accessible, next to a high-speed rail station, next to a BART station, it's worth more than land that's not. And in Europe, and in parts of Asia, that excess value is being taxed to help pay at least the operating costs, and in some cases, toward the debt that was accumulated for the capital cost of the project. And in America, we find it very hard to do that. Land use is controlled by local authorities, and probably at some point we will get there, but the state will have to intervene in order to give the local authorities the right to do that, or the responsibility to do that. And we're a long way from that too. So we can teach classes about it, tell students what a great idea it is and how it's working in Singapore, and then immediately local officials say, but this is not Singapore, and it is not, and we have a very different set of rules.
That segues nicely to the next question, which is how might new technologies affect the future viability of loss? And they provided a specific example, which is, will the ability to easily collect EMT data provide new options for loss in the future, or will this return time transport tax powers to the state? Return the transport tax powers to the state.
California is deeply into a study of mileage-based user fees, or do they prefer to call it road user charges because it sounds a little bit less intimidating, maybe. So there was an experiment with 5,400 participants who had their mileage tracked in one way or another, and who received sort of like monopoly money bills once a month, so that you could pay you could simulate paying for your road use through a credit card every month. And 11 Western, now I think it's now up to 14 Western states are joining with California, so there'd be one system throughout the West Coast, the western part of the United States, as far east as Nevada and Oklahoma and Utah. And we clearly see a future after the gas tax when there will be a user fee of that sort. And again, it's politically complex, and people come to the meetings of the task force doing this experiment, and parade up and down with signs and say we don't want this and so on. It's very controversial. But on the other hand, think about it. If there is a state uniform fee, that money could actually be distributed back to the cities or counties in which the driving occurred. That is, if you're monitoring the driving, you know where the driving took place. And so part of the money, at least, could go to local governments in place of local option sales taxes, because you know that, of this person's mileage driven, 12% was in Santa Clara County, 11% was in Marin, and if you add that all up, it could be distributed back to the local areas. And and you could also have different prices at different times of day, at different congestion levels. You could have different prices for electric vehicles because you want to encourage their acquisition, and for gasoline vehicles. So it's a very flexible system, but it would conceivably in the long term be a replacement for local option sales taxes. But again, it's one thing to talk about possibly sometime, decades in the future, and another thing to try to solve our problems right now, which are very challenging.
Absolutely. Thank you. Do bonds make sense for funding transportation, especially if not backed by new revenue?
Bonds make about as much sense for funding transportation as a mortgage makes sense for a home. And that's good sense. I mean, I can live in a house for 30 years while paying the mortgage, and I can use the roads that I've built or the transit system that has been built for the next 30 or 40 years and buy it at a lower construction cost by borrowing money and paying it off over time. And the sales tax is a relatively stable source of revenue over a long period of time. So it's possible to issue bonds backed by sales tax revenue and actually get some people to buy them, which is an important factor, right? Municipal bonds and other bonds have to be attractive to potential bondholders. And the sales tax is a way of doing that. And I think, of course, large capital costs for projects, let's say high-speed rail, right? Thompson this year is working on high-speed rail. We're not going to be able to manage a project of that sort without bonds, and bonds are completely reasonable if there's an assured revenue stream and if there is confidence that the revenue will flow in the future. The sales tax, it gives us much more confidence than, for example, cap and trade, which is being used for high-speed rail, which is more volatile and harder to predict. So, yes, if it's sound, and be careful if it's not.
Terrific analogy, and one I will use going forward with your consent about the mortgage. Very, very well done, thank you. Second comment from the same person. Can you please discuss legislative actions to circumvent voter decisions with the example of Prop 42 from approximately 2004 and how it was obliterated with the gas tax swap?
I find, I've studied the gas tax swap. I wrote a 200-page report on the gas tax swap. And once I finished it, I had to look myself in the eye and say, I still don't understand it. It's so complicated. Will the person who asked the question summarize Proposition 42? That would be a good start.
I see, Rachel Morgan from Santa Cruz. I think Prop 42 is. I mean, the overall goal of Prop 42, as I understood it, was to put a lockbox around the sales tax on gasoline that was dedicated to transportation to kind of levelize what went into the public transportation account. And so similar to Prop 69 that voters approved in June was saying, hey, we really want transportation revenues. We want the commitment from the state to make sure that they go there. And then, of course, the state hit the recession. The legislature was challenged with how to fund other general fund things. And so then all of a sudden we had the 2010 gas tax swap, which many of us are worried decimated funds for the STIP and local streets and roads. And
so I felt that many, all through these years, I thought that, well, we have Article 19 of the state constitution, which protects gasoline tax as a user fee by putting the money into, I guess California has two trust funds, but it reserves the money for expenditures on transportation. But then we argue, is buying land for environmental mitigation, is that spending it on transportation? Some people say yes, and some say no. Is spending it on transit or on land use, new transit stations, consistent with Article 19? Some say yes, some say no. And these various propositions were put on the ballot by different interests, all of whom wanted to protect the money for pursuing their vision of what diversion means. But I think when you add them all up, we're pretty close at this point to making it very hard to divert the fund. And the governors, both Schwarzenegger and Gray David, declared a fiscal emergency. And there was a fiscal challenge during that time period. And the measures that had preceded the most recent one had in it provisions that said if the governor declares a fiscal emergency, an exception can be made. But even with that exception being made, the money that was, quote, diverted was used to pay mostly, you have to qualify everything because it's so complicated, there are so many details, but it was mostly used to pay bond payments on transportation projects, which should have been paid, according to those who see it as diversion, by general revenues, which had been committed by general, but general revenues were scarce. And so they said, well, within the spirit of Article 19 and with recognition of the difficult times we're in, we are going to divert, but then we're going to repay it over time, and it was all very complicated. I'd like to think that Article 19, and this, you saw that other states, Connecticut, I guess, is having a similar discussion right now, and the subsequent adjustments are sufficient to allow us to, it allowed me to stand in front of an audience of lay people and say, no, they can't divert the money to schools and fire and education, no matter how important those are to the state, because of all of these things now collectively being in place, each one correcting, elaborating on a previous one. But the core is Article 19, and they're all sort of expansions of that. And I can't exactly explain what happened because it was so arcane. I mean, I've read the documents, and I still don't understand. And I've called people who were like legislative staffers at that time, and they say, well, I don't completely understand. So that's very dangerous, but it is true.
And personally frightening to me that you don't understand it clearly, so thank you for that. We're at the point in the program where we have time for one more question. I understand there are 6 questions we won't make it to, so Marty, we hope that you'll stick around a little bit. Is there any sense of how many local option projects rely on Senate Bill 1 funding to complete the necessary?
That's a great question. The answer is quite a few, and especially where the costs have escalated. So if Senate Bill 1 funding is distributed back to the counties according to a formula, and the uses of that money are flexible, most of the counties which have local option sales taxes have already stated that they will use that money to complete projects that have been under construction and started with measured money. And so, yeah, I should have actually mentioned that before. But that's a very, very good question, and the answer is clear that a lot of that money, SB1 money that goes back to local government, will be used to complete projects promised under local option sales taxes. Good question.
One final follow-up question in that same regard. We're hearing that there are 6,500 safety-critical transportation projects currently being funded that are in process through Senate Bill 1. Those projects, if the repeal effort is successful, will no longer have funding to be completed. What happens?
I've looked at the proposition, and I don't know exactly when the money is turned off if the proposition passes. The taxes go back. By the way, if we go back, if Proposition 6 is successful, we go back to the gas tax swap. That was the law. The SB1 changed, so the swap that you mentioned a few minutes ago will come back into effect, and the State Board of Equalization will have to adjust the tax annually, and that means that we can't predict with the same certainty as we can under SB1 what the future gas tax revenue will be. So I don't exactly know. I mean, several of the provisions of SB1 have not yet kicked in. The $100 user fee on electric vehicles doesn't start for another year. I'm presuming if the proposition is successful, those will never kick in. But what about the taxes that are in place now? Will they stop the day after the election or January 1st? I'm not actually sure. I tried to find that out. And I can't figure it out from reading. Somebody must know in the legislature, but I don't know. I believe that a large proportion of those projects would stop, but I don't exactly know when. And to the extent that they can, I'm sure that Caltrans and the California Transportation Commission will try to reallocate funds to complete projects that are 2/3, 3/4, of the way to completion from other sources, and forego other projects that are not yet started in order to be rational. But that's my best guess. I certainly don't know what they'll do.
Well, let's hope we don't have to find out. Please join me in thanking Marty for his time and for sharing his expertise. We appreciate you joining us for our Visiting Scholar Series. If you would like to be on our distribution list so you have opportunities to participate in the future, please give me your card. And again, have a wonderful day. Thank you.